My name is Rick Eisensee. I'm the clinical consultant for the Shanti project, and I'll be talking some more about some clinically oriented issues. Basically, I'll be covering suicide and some of our policies related to both suicide and substance abuse. So at the end of my speaking, I'll encourage questions related to these various aspects. I'll also be talking some about what has been experienced as working with difficult client situations in crisis intervention. Basically, we have some policies oriented towards dealing with these various situations that have to do with the relationship of a volunteer kind of contact with their clients that takes into consideration our role as non-professionals, as paraprofessionals, working with people in a supportive kind of way. So as a backup to that and as an adjunct to it, we have our staff available for people to consult with, as well as the support groups that you're in. The support and supervision groups are very important. Jim, Flo, and Bea will be explaining to you more about the function of the support groups next week. And I just want to point out that they're definitely our first resource in terms of touching in with other people and getting feedback about how we're feeling, how we're dealing with the client situations that are coming up, and any difficulties that seem to arise. Basically, I'm wanting to emphasize that none of us are out there on a limb by ourselves. Now, there may be times when you are dealing with something by yourself at 1 o'clock in the morning, but even then, you can call other people, you can call crisis intervention centers, you can call me. I've dealt with a number of situations at 1 o'clock in the morning. And basically, I just want to give that message across that it's really important that we reach out and get the support that we need, the guidance we need, the debriefing that we need, and that Charlie was speaking about earlier. I think it's really crucial. In terms of suicide is really, it brings up a lot of feelings and some fears and concerns in people in dealing with it. It's like we start feeling ourselves getting a little edgy and wondering what our role should be in dealing with someone who's suicidal. Basically, I think it's important to realize that someone in that condition still needs our support and our being there and our paying attention to them and our being really available for them at that time as much as any other time. And it's important that we not let our own anxiety about being suicidal come across to them in such a way so that they feel inhibited talking about it. Because one of the main things a person who's feeling suicidal needs to do is to talk about it. Research has shown that people who have the chance to talk about it are far less likely to commit suicide. So it's really important that we be there for them. I'd like to make some distinctions in terms of suicidal crises that we might be coming into contact with. One of those might be an acute grief crisis. And those look slightly different from someone who's feeling suicidal towards the end of a terminal illness and is wanting to end it rather than go on in protracted suffering. For someone who's in an immediate grief kind of crisis, oftentimes the world looks to them pretty bleakly. It's very difficult for them to imagine that life could go on the same way that it was before their lover died. And in some ways, that has a lot of truth to it. The world seems to close in on them, and it seems as though the only way left to them is to kill themselves. And our first response to that is to acknowledge that it must feel devastating to have had your life narrowed and closed off in such a way, and to really acknowledge that pain that that person is suffering. And to also follow up with questions about what it is they're actually thinking of in terms of ending their life. Sometimes people are concerned that they might put some ideas into someone's head if we bring up the actual question, are you thinking of killing yourself? To someone who's kind of skirted around that and who seems as though they might be leaning that way. But we don't put any ideas into people's minds that aren't there already. And as a matter of fact, it's oftentimes a relief to someone to be able to talk about it, to realize that you can handle dealing with that issue. People often feel somewhat embarrassed that they're even thinking that way because suicide isn't seen as being socially acceptable. So I think it's really important that we are there, that we do pursue that question with people, and that we really listen to what they're experiencing at that point. A number of people who I've dealt with who have been in a suicidal place, in some ways felt as though that was the last area in their lives that they did have some control over. And this can apply to people who are ill as well. It's important for them to think that if everything else fails or whatever, that is an option for them. And by facing that option, sometimes people can work past that and move through it. So we don't want to make people feel that by thinking suicidally that there's something wrong with them, or that that's a thought that they should just banish from themselves, because otherwise those things will build off and they might act more impetuously than they would otherwise if they had had a chance to think through things and to consider them more closely. In terms of our involvement with them, if over the course of a few hours someone's not feeling any differently about their suicidal intent than they were when you first begin to talk, if it comes to the point where they actually have a plan, they have a method, and they have the means to carry out that plan, they have a time chosen in which they're planning on doing it, and they're not willing to either agree with you to not do it until some other time in the future, or until they've at least talked to someone first, then you need to start discussing with them that it seems as though you've gotten to a place where you need to be protected in a safe kind of environment. And usually the course of bringing that up will allow them to see that they do need to seek other help. And that can take the form of calling up other people in the project, calling the crisis intervention unit, the Mission Crisis Center, during the day until like 11 at night, and at night calling one of the emergency rooms, the psych emergency rooms in the city, to get them to some help so that they can be evaluated and seen whether or not they should be held for a 72-hour hold while they're feeling that way. This seems to contradict our sense of someone having an option. And part of that contradiction lies in the notion that a crisis does not usually last forever, that someone feeling this way now, they'll usually move through that, and they need to be protected while they're feeling that way. Most of our client situations where people have gotten to that place of feeling pretty suicidal and even having some plans and intent to do that, do not move into a place where they're needing to be hospitalized for it. They can usually talk that through and make some agreement with you that they won't kill themselves for some unspecified amount of time. The longer amount of time, of course, the better. If someone's willing to agree not to kill themselves for 6 months, that's great. Sometimes they won't be willing to promise that until tomorrow morning. And then you need to be back in touch with them and make sure that you're hooking them up with some other referral resources, such as another therapist in town who can be monitoring their situation. Now I'd like to shift a little bit and talk about what about someone who's terminally ill, who in all likelihood will die within a few weeks, is suffering protracted pain, is making some decisions about the quality of life that they're wanting to live through these last moments of life. And some of them are deciding to kill themselves. You know, how do we fit into that? First of all, I'd like to suggest that, again, this isn't something that any of us has to take upon ourselves in terms of deciding or making judgments about. It's really important that you let your group leader know, that you let Flo and Bee know, or someone else in the project if they're not available, that this is the point that you're reaching with this client. Basically, our policy is that people have a right to die consciously. Included in that is that they need to provide their own means for themselves, that we cannot participate in that. We cannot participate in acquiring the means for them, nor can we be there while they take whatever means they've acquired to kill themselves. The other thing that we need to do, in order for someone to consciously die in our notion of that concept, is that they need to be speaking to the other people who are close to them, including their relatives, their physician, a psychotherapist if they're involved in therapy, and discussing those things with them as well. If one of our volunteers is put in a position where they're the only ones who know about a person's intent because they're afraid to tell anyone else about that, then I think it's really important that you clue in other people in the project that this is going on so that we can discuss that that's the case and where we want to go from there, so that you're not left on a limb dealing with this by yourself. Now, to some extent, that touches on the whole area of confidentiality, and it's true that it is a violation of a person's confidentiality in a sense to let other people know what's going on. But this is a matter, as they say, of life and death. It's also a matter of not only you being out there dealing with some person as though you were friends of theirs, but it's a matter of the whole project as a whole being involved in this decision. The whole project meaning the staff and our connections with other professional helping people in the community, so that we can network amongst ourselves to come up with some sort of decision about those issues. Basically, if a physician or a monitoring psychotherapist is informed of this decision, then they're the ones who can make the decision about hospitalizing somebody under 5150 code for being of danger to themselves when they're about to die in a couple of weeks anyway. You know, they're the ones who could then end up deciding that they're willing to challenge the current thinking about these issues in medical circles and take the responsibility for that. They're the ones who it's appropriate to make that decision, rather than one of our volunteers taking that on themselves. Well, that's a pretty extreme place, and it's not something that comes up every month or so. But it is important for us to be aware of kind of our protocol in dealing with these situations, so that we have a notion that, first of all, we're not out there on a limb, and also that these people will be looked after and their wishes followed as much as is possible, and that we're not stuck making the final decisions about those things. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the whole notion of manipulation. This ties some into the issue of limit setting as well. A lot of times, people who have tried to kill themselves have had kind of a bum rap. People have gotten burnt out dealing with them and then have accused them of being manipulative. I think that it's wise for us to look a little bit at this whole notion of manipulation. My understanding of it is that it takes two to be manipulated. It's very difficult for someone to manipulate you if you're not allowing yourself to be manipulated. I'd also like to back up a bit and say that in terms of suicide, I don't see people using that to get attention for the most part. I think there are times when people do end up getting attention, and that can certainly reinforce that kind of behavior. But we needn't get to the point where we're just tossing people off because we feel like they're crying wolf. If we're able to set effective and clear limits with very clear consequences with people from the beginning, then we're far less likely to end up feeling as though we're being led around them or rushing off to rescue them in the middle of the night when we realize that they're just drunk and needed some attention or something like that anyway. if we can, recently we had someone who was very upset and was really in a crisis point. As far as he was concerned, he didn't have any other options except to kill himself. And a lot of people got pretty wound up about it. He'd go to one person, they'd start things in motion, then he'd go to another person. Pretty soon there were like 4 different people looking after his situation and trying to get him a place to live and get this going and that going for him. And it finally came to the point where people were pretty fed up with him. They found out all the different things that he had gotten going, which was actually very good networking on his part. If he had only gotten them to talk to each other, then things might have gone along a lot more effectively. But people got pretty pissed off at him too. And I think it was useful for us to kind of sit back then and look at, okay, now what are we wanting to do with this situation? And what was clear was that we needed to let him know what were the consequences of his suicidal behavior. And those were that if he had a specific plan, and if he had the means to follow through with it, if he had a time and intended to do so, and was not willing to make an agreement with us to not do so, then he needed to be hospitalized for his own safety. And once he knew that those were the parameters in which he was dealing, then he toned down considerably and was willing to make some agreements and was willing to actually take care of some of the things that were kind of confusing or messed up for him in his life and take a little more control and power over those things. Similarly with substance abuse, I think it's really important for us to make clear what our policies are in dealing with people who are using drugs or alcohol. Our sessions aren't really effective with somebody who's really high. Though somebody afterwards may say that, we really got down, when I was loaded, my mind just goes a lot more quickly and clearly, and I think like this, and I'm less inhibited, and I'm able to really talk about what I care about, and I'm able to cry and so on. All of that may sound fairly plausible, especially if you were with them while they were high and all these things happen during the course of that. Usually, though, they don't remember a whole hell of a lot of that afterwards, and it's not a real kind of working through. So basically our policy is that people not be high or loaded during our sessions with them. We also need to address if it becomes apparent that somebody's an alcoholic or using drugs in a consistent fashion so that they're obviously addicted to it. So even though they're not loaded while you're having a session with them, their lives are in utter chaos and crisis in between sessions, so that you're feeling as though you're running after and picking up the pieces from whatever binges they had just been on. That needs to be addressed too. And it can be confronted in a gentle way, but also a firm way. And oftentimes brought up in terms of how have you dealt, what kinds of coping mechanisms have you used in the past when things have really seemed rough, what seemed available for you. And part of what comes up with that is the use of drugs and alcohol, and you can begin to monitor how much it is that they are using, encouraging them to keep track of that themselves. Oftentimes by keeping track of their use, people cut down on it considerably. We also have various referrals. Within the Shanti Project itself, we have a number of people who have been involved with Alcoholics Anonymous, and there's an Alcoholics Anonymous group now for people with AIDS. So that's a great resource that we have for people with alcohol-related issues. We also have various referrals for drug kinds of programs and so on. When somebody initially calls us, if they're feeling suicidal right then, or if we know at intake that they're already having a problem with alcohol or with drug abuse, then we address that right then at intake, letting them know that in order for us to see them, they need to be seeing a therapist. If they're feeling suicidal, they need to be in some sort of alcohol or drug treatment program if they're dealing with substance abuse. That's in addition to us seeing them and dealing with them as well. We don't turn people away if they're having these other kinds of issues, but we do need to be rather careful as to what kinds of contact and agreements that we have with them. We have an authorization of release of information form that we have clients sign who are involved in these various sorts of situations that allows the staff to talk with their attending physician and their therapists. At times we also check in with them to see if they'd be willing, if the therapist would be willing to speak with a volunteer. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But in any event, that will be monitored through the office. We'll be feeding that back directly to you, as well as letting your group leaders know sort of where things stand with those issues. There's another area that I wanted to address, and that's the whole notion of denial. Sometimes people have been pretty familiar with denial either from a substance abuse kind of angle or from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of dying. And I'd like to distinguish between those two kinds of denial because I think it's the same word used for very different kinds of situations that we should be approaching in very different ways. The kind of denial that takes place in substance abuse is a way of denying that it's a problem for oneself, and there's all kinds of ways for making excuses, rationalizations, and so on as to why it's not really a problem. And that needs to be confronted directly by us. It needs to be discussed in terms of how we see it as a problem and interfering with our relationship in a counseling relationship. I think it's also useful to point out, as Tom probably spoke of earlier, that alcohol use, even as an interim kind of coping mechanism, doesn't really help people very well cope with things. They tend to get depressed, and it really affects their whole affect around dealing with issues. So I think it's really important to confront that directly. In terms of denial with life-threatening illness, what does that really mean? There's a couple of notions that I've come to be familiar with, and I've seen myself at work with people confronting a life-threatening illness. The first notion is that of selective attention. Now, how many of us can actually take in the thought that our days are numbered immediately, 24 hours a day? It's very difficult. It's pretty overwhelming, and it's not something that people are wanting to talk about all the time, even with their own counselors. And so I think the notion of following people along, pacing ourselves with them, seeing what it is that they're wanting to talk about, providing openings here and there, but not trying to break through denial to get them to move on to the next stage. I think that that's a pretty unnecessary and somewhat damaging kind of way to approach someone. The other notion of denial that I think is useful to look at is that part of the research that's been done in terms of healing has a lot to do with attitude. Norman Cousins speaks of a healing kind of attitude that helps people function within whatever limitation they have, even if they are terminally ill. And denial, in a sense, helps people to focus on the quality of life that they're experiencing right now, rather than constantly obsessing about the fact that they're going to be totally gone very soon. So both selective attention and attitudinal healing are two concepts that I think are necessary to balance out the whole notion of denial. I'd like to open it up to questions and relating to our policies around substance abuse and suicide, or what people are wanting to do in certain kinds of situations, what to do with difficult clients or people who are real angry, or basically anything that was covered this morning by Tom or Charlie as well. I know sometimes it sort of takes a while for these things to settle in and have things bubble up.
I just have sort of a story to tell, which is pretty brief. It's based on my experience when I was spending time with my lover Mark when he was getting close to the ending stage for him. And he was at home at the time. It must have been maybe 2 weeks before he actually died. And I was there, and I think he was in the bathroom, and then he came out to his bedroom, and he said, "Michael, I've been really scared lately." He said, "I've been thinking about suicide." And I sort of was taken aback and didn't say anything at first, and then I said, "Well, how does that make you feel?" And he said, "Well, it really scares me that I'm thinking about it, but then it really scares me not to think about it too." And that was the end of the discussion. I mean, it wasn't really a discussion. I think he just wanted to say that was happening, and I appreciated that he was able to talk about it. And I think for him, which is probably the case for many people when they're facing this, and especially if they're very ill, sometimes it's not the thought of death, it's the thought of dying that's the most frightening. And I think that's what he was referring to mostly, of just, I'm not feeling well now, it's difficult now, but I don't think I want to go on with it, or I'm scared of what it might be. So that was all. And I think it was just sort of a matter of being able to talk about it, defused it a bit. I never really got the sense that he was thinking about it too clearly. And maybe it would have been different for some people if maybe your life support is having a plug plugged into the wall and you could pull a plug. If it meant taking some more elaborate action, then it gets a little bit more difficult thinking about it. That's all.
Thanks. The notion I'm reminded of is the whole notion of ambivalence. People aren't usually reaching out to us and calling suicide prevention or calling us or so on unless they're wanting to reach out some way and talk things through and work things through. Suicide is an immediate solution that they've come up with. But if we can get to the underlying problems, what are the feelings, what's the hopelessness, what are the parameters that they're faced with that bring them to thinking of that solution, then sometimes they can ease off of that.
Something that Tom brought up this morning I need a little bit more on. Perhaps you could define the notion of co-alcoholism, and I assume that includes other substances, and elaborate on that in terms of the counseling relationship. What is our role around that?
I think that's a real important notion for us to become familiar with if we can. The idea is that people who are involved with someone who, let's take alcoholism, people who are involved in an alcoholic's life end up in many and various and quite subtle ways facilitating that person's alcoholism, unknowingly oftentimes, by providing excuses for them, by making things up for them, by covering up for them, by not following through on the limits that they've set with them previously, and so on. For example, if a person is alcoholic and oversleeps for work, the boss calls and you take the call for them instead of letting them live with their own consequences for facing what happens when they go on a bender and they can't function the next day. Those are some of the more obvious ways. In a counseling relationship, it becomes a bit more delicate and has to do with this whole confrontive kind of role that we take on somewhat for ourselves, and hopefully as much as possible can refer out to professionals who are versed in dealing with alcoholism, as well as Alcoholics Anonymous, which is a real good resource. But oftentimes people won't go there, and here we still are with them. And how do we keep ourselves from falling into that same trap of kind of being a co-person with them? And I think that one way to do that is by coming up with some limits ourselves. And we don't have to make them up out of thin air. We can talk to other people in the project about it, again, to reach out for support for ourselves. Some of those just that seem real obvious are if you go to a meeting with your client and your client's drunk, you don't sit there and meet with them then. You say, you know, we talked about this before. It looks as though you've been drinking again. And so what I'd like to do is to make another appointment to see you tomorrow. That's difficult to do. They might be crying or they might be very angry and so on too. So it's pretty tempting to just sit there with them. But if we do that, we're reinforcing their drinking. We're telling them that what we said before in terms of a limit doesn't really hold and so on. If they're suicidal, then we do need to stay with them and get them to a point where they're willing to make an agreement with us not to kill themselves, or we can get them to a treatment center.
Do that against their will?
You mean if somebody, the question was just asked, do you do that against their will? If someone is not willing to make an agreement with you not to kill themselves, if it's gotten to the point where you've talked with them for hours, they haven't calmed down, they haven't gotten to a point where they're willing to seek other assistance, and they actually have a means, a plan, and a time in which they're wanting to do that, carry through with it and intending to do so, and they're not willing to make an agreement with you not to, yes, then we can call in extra help to have them evaluated and hospitalized against their will. It's called a 72-hour hold, and it's carried out through the 5150 code. And it is basically hospitalizing someone for their own safety while they're feeling that way, which is an extreme situation. We want people to see that that's the place that they've reached. Usually when we suggest that we have gotten to that place, then they will agree not to kill themselves rather than be hospitalized. But occasionally we've had cases where people could not see themselves making that agreement and could see that it was necessary for us to take control over their situations. But again, this isn't something that you're needing to decide just yourself. You should be on the phone calling other people in the project as well as the crisis center yourself to let them know what you're dealing with, and they can give you some guidance over the phone before they actually call the police if they're not willing to just go with you. So that's kind of the extreme limit that it can go to, is actually having them hospitalized.
Can you describe what might be different or what we might see or experience differently working with clients who are facing a life-threatening illness but previous to that have a history of maybe chronic depression or a lot of suicide attempts or a lot of unresolved grief?
Yeah, that's a good point. People come to us because of their grieving or because they're facing a life-threatening illness themselves, and that's a major crisis in their lives. People bring to that particular crisis whatever coping mechanisms they've had in their lives before that, and some of those might have been depression, withdrawal, use of various substances, and suicidal behavior before that. Sometimes we get an inkling of that at intake, but sometimes we don't. Oftentimes what volunteers note is a sense of chaos in the person's life that may reflect itself in not having a place to live, being out on the streets, not being able to follow through with some appointments, and some other kinds of things. It also has a lot to do with how someone's coming across, whether you're seeming to be able to make a connection with them, how willing they are to trust you, and so on. There have been a few times where someone was not using substances and they were not suicidal, where we still were encouraging them to get other kind of psychotherapeutic help. And it does help, you know, for our counselors to be talking with about that in their support group and getting some ideas from the office as well. If you're starting to pick up on some difficulties, angry outbursts towards you too, as well as being angry at all else that's happening around them, those are some cues as well. But I also don't want to pathologize a normal reaction to finding out a disaster has happened to you. Some people have been pretty freaked out for a few days and then begin to deal with it in a more, in a less self-destructive kind of manner very quickly afterwards. Other people who have had a style of pretty self-destructive behavior before, say, a diagnosis or a loved one has died, continue to operate in that pattern. It's not changed at all, and their lives can be really pretty chaotic.
Yes, I was wondering if you would explain more, maybe even expand more on the concepts of dealing with suicide and with euthanasia, their right to die.
Mm-hmm. Do you have, it sounds like you have kind of a notion about that.
Sure. Sounds like it, feels like it too. I've dealt with both. I've had to deal with both, and they're both very strong feelings. And it becomes a personal one each time when you deal with it, especially when you start dealing with euthanasia. I guess I have a lot more feeling of resentment towards people who become suicidal, in that I feel like maybe sometimes they've given up their hope. Yeah, in euthanasia, maybe they haven't given up the hope, they've realized the realities. But dealing with that, I think it's something we may face. It's something we really do face. I mean, you talk about dealing with people who are in their last weeks, days. They feel it, they know it. I think there's still an internal thing going on for us, and how we deal with that with them.
I'd like to separate that into a couple of parts. One is like our own personal feelings and reactions to that and what that brings up in us. And the other is sort of more of a technical policy laden side of it that has to do with our functioning as an agency. Agencies, because of their liability, legal liability, have a bias, have a built-in bias against suicide. You know, I think it's reasonable for us to simply recognize that that exists, and that whenever, you know, like we're possibly party to someone, or to knowing that someone's going to commit suicide, then we become a part of that system, especially as volunteers within an agency. So that's partly why I'm emphasizing so much that we need to be talking with other people, specifically B and Flo, about these issues as they're arising, so that it's not just us as volunteers out on a limb dealing with the situation. Basically, we need to let people know that in order for them to consciously die from our point of view, that they need to be talking to other people about that, which includes their physician and their loved ones. And that if they're not willing to do that, it can come to the point where someone in the office will need to call their physician or therapist to let them know that that's actually happening. Now that may indeed interrupt or interfere with what we perceive as their right to die if they're having a difficulty obtaining the means for that, and anyone else knowing about it would interfere with that. And that's partly the limitation that we're faced with as an agency. In terms of our own personal beliefs about that, you know, they range widely from someone like yourself who is saying that you felt resentful about someone who is wanting to kill themselves when other people are trying desperately to hold on to their lives. You know, how ironic that becomes. And yet with someone who's faced with protracted pain in the last moments of their lives, who are we to insist that they continue on with that? This is a whole field that still has not been resolved within legal circles, and so we're left with our own personal feelings about that, which we do need to process with each other and take into consideration, as well as deal with about what's going to happen next. Certainly a physician or a psychotherapist would want to, want to know our point of view as well, and what our experiences have been. Sometimes we end up having far more time with a client than any professional helping person does. And so our point of view is important, as well as, of course, the client who's dealing with the situation themselves. There's not a cut and dried kind of answer to it. We're addressing each issue as it comes up. I'm wanting to make clear, though, that it's not something that someone is going to be deciding on their own out there on a limb, and that you're not to do that either. That our protocol is for you to let be and know that this is taking place, so that we can then kind of consult with each other about what steps we're wanting to take next. The other thing, too, is that there often exists a certain amount of ambivalence, even for people who are in that very protracted place where they're wanting to have at least that last bit of control over their last moments. Just because someone's talking about that doesn't mean that we should assume that that's what's going to happen. We should hear them through. We should allow them to speak of those things. Sometimes they work through that to another kind of place altogether. Sometimes pain that people had thought would be unbearable comes and passes and increases, and yet they're able to deal with it in an entirely different way than they were able to before. And so their whole notion of what they would do if things got this bad suddenly shifts. A few trainings ago, a woman spoke with us whose husband had liver cancer, and who had been planning on ending it considerably further before anything had developed to the point where he was existing now. Shifts took place in the family. Shifts took place in the intimacy that they shared together as husband and wife. Shifts took place in the way that he dealt with his pain, to the point where he was experiencing something else that he had never even imagined before. And I think that's important for us to be open to, and not get on our own agenda about someone's right to die as soon as they bring up the subject. Thanks.